Okay, good evening, everyone. My name is Sarah Pate, and I would like to welcome you on behalf of the Washington Center for the Book, an affiliate of the Library of Congress Center for the Book, and a partnership between the Washington State Library and the Seattle Public Library. The Washington Center for the Book promotes literacy and a love of books, reading, and libraries. We celebrate Washington's robust literary heritage and shine a spotlight on the contribution of reading and libraries in strengthening communities and in fostering civic engagement. One of our projects is the Washington State Book Award, and we are thrilled to present the third in a series of online events with our 2020 Washington State Book Award winners with you here tonight. Our next event will be February 17th at 6 p.m. with Eric Sigliano, author of The Big Thaw, Ancient Carbon, Modern Science, and a Race to Save the World. I will put a link for that event in the chat after this introduction. We'd also like to thank our event partner for tonight and for this entire series, the Washington Library Association. I'd like to welcome Brianna Hoffman, WLA Executive Director, to say a few words.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Since 1931, WLA has been a leader in the Washington Library community with over 1,100 members from academic, public, special, and school libraries. We provide advocacy, professional development, and leadership opportunities while promoting intellectual freedom and innovation. We are so excited and honored to be partnering with our friends, the Washington Center for the Book, for this series of events. On behalf of WLA, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Now back to Sarah to introduce our author.
As you have questions this evening for Erin, please put them in the Q&A section so that we can help facilitate getting your questions to Erin when the Q&A portions of this evening begins. Erin Bobrow-Strain is professor and Baker Ferguson Chair of Politics and Leadership at Whitman College. His writing on food, immigration, and the U.S.-Mexico border has appeared in The Believer, the Chronicle of Higher Education Review, Salon, and Gastronomica. He is also the author of White Bread, A Social History of the Store-Bought Loaf, and Intimate Enemies, Landowners, Power, and Violence in Chiapas. Winner of the 2020 Washington State Book Award for Biography, The Death and Life of Ada Hernandez, A Border Story asks, what happens when an undocumented teen mother takes on the U.S. immigration system? In addition to the Washington State Book Award, The Death and Life of Ada Hernandez won the 2020 Pacific Northwest Book Award, was shortlisted for the Brooklyn Public Library Literary Prize, and was named a Southwest Book of the Year. Erin Bobrow-Strain, welcome, and thank you for being with us this evening.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. It's great to be here. Thank you, Brianna. Also, the Washington Public Library Association, the Washington Center for the Book, thank you, and the Seattle Public Library, thank you so much. I'm really honored and grateful to be here to receive this award. It's particularly, I have to say, it's particularly moving to receive this award in the biography category. And I'll tell you that when Ida heard this, Ida is the real person at the heart of this book. When Ida heard this, and actually the very first time she saw just the word biography printed on the Library of Congress page, classification page of the book, tears just started pouring down her face. And eventually she kind of was able to talk, and she said, I just can't believe that a person like me can have a biography written about them. I grew up thinking that I was a crime and that my country hated me. And now I read messages and reviews from folks who have read my story and think I'm a hero. That was one of the hands down, one of the happiest moments for me in the life of this book. So it's really great to be able to receive this in the biography award, in the biography category. So yesterday I was in a Zoom session with the journalist Giselle Fernandez, who is one of the executive producers of what will hopefully be a television series based on Ida's journey. And Giselle was talking about how when we talk about undocumented people, there are two undocumenteds. There's the lack of immigration papers, and then there's the way that undocumented people's stories, their beautiful, flawed, full of humor and wit and struggle and incredible resilience stories, so often go undocumented. And especially stories that fall outside the kind of allowable permitted boundaries of either the flawless, high achieving Harvard valedictorian, quote unquote, good immigrant trope, or the criminal gangster, quote unquote, bad immigrant trope. We're talking about real stories. And this is changing with books like Carla Cornejos, The Undocumented Americans, and a whole series of incredible new memoirs right now. But biography seems to remain solidly the realm of the so-called greats and notables, mostly men. So tonight I want to introduce you to a woman who is fighting every day to live a big, messy, wonderful human life that is as full of dignity and worth and remarkable accomplishments and achievements as the life of any great or notable. So thank you. But this isn't only a story about Ida. As much as it is a story about Ida, it is also a story told in collaboration with Ida about the almost unsurvivable world that we, those of us who look at borders and immigration from a more privileged position, have made on the US-Mexico border and in immigration policy. And in that sense, this is a book about complicity and our responsibility to unmake that world that we've made. If we have some time at the end, I can talk a little bit about the prospects for that unmaking, the punitive, cruel, wasteful immigration system in a Biden administration. What are the prospects for that? And if I run out of time for that, I would also just love to take questions about that in the Q&A. Although we have seen some really incredibly promising signs in the past couple of weeks, deportations continue by the hundreds. Trump's Title 42 policy that has allowed for hundreds of thousands of asylum seekers to be expelled with no due process under the supposed guise of public health. It remains. The Remain in Mexico program is under review as of today, but not rescinded. The for-profit immigration detention center where Ida was imprisoned, like all immigration detention centers, were explicitly excluded from the president's ban on federal private prison contracts. There's some great executive orders on immigration today that we can talk about, but they were also signaling a slow road and a difficult road ahead for undoing Trump-era immigration policies and rebuilding the asylum system. Biden's really impressive immigration reform bill is facing incredible obstacles in Congress. So you all know this already, but the struggle is just beginning on this. So this book, though, it starts in a different time, in the middle of a really different kind of struggle. And we open on the border in 2008, 13 years ago. We are perched between the United States and Mexico, between life and death, and a Mexican ambulance is speeding towards the port of entry in Arizona. Ida's face is swollen and purple. Her arms are torn. She's bleeding from 9 stab wounds in the stomach and torso. And the ambulance is racing alongside the latest border wall. Agua Prieta, Sonora, where Ida was born, is on the left. On her right is Douglas, Arizona, where she's lived from age 8 until age 20, until a tiny mishap just a month earlier had led to her deportation. And these two towns have been so closely intertwined for so long that some people just call them Dogla Prieta, one community, united, not divided by the border. Residents who are just a little bit older than Ida remember a time of summer baseball games where home plate was in the United States and the outfield was in Mexico, when language and families and businesses and culture blur the border every day since these towns were founded. But it's 2008 now. And at that point, 15 years of bipartisan border hardening have driven a wedge between these two communities. Emergency medical transfers across the border, though, are still routine unless something goes wrong. And Frank Hone, a Douglas paramedic, watches as everything goes wrong as the Mexican ambulance pulls into the port of entry and unloads. Officers surround Ida's gurney, refusing to let her pass. Families stream in from both sides of the border, and someone knocks into the gurney and Ida shrieks awake. "Please, I have a US citizen son. Please let me pass." And there's a stunned silence. Sunday shoppers who are crossing back from Walmart in Arizona stop to stare. And the paramedic sees his chance and he whisks Ida out of one of the most heavily secured spots in the American Southwest. A little while later, Arizona Lifeline 2 lifts off from the JCPenney's parking lot and sets a course to a hospital in Tucson. As it rises, it skims over high-tech surveillance towers and what was then the country's largest Border Patrol station. Then it heads over the Mule Mountains and it soars over the last highway immigration checkpoint and it breaks free of the border. And the paramedic looks down at his clipboard and he reads Ida's name for the first time. And he's done everything he can do, he thinks, but Ida Hernandez is not going to make it. She does survive, and I'm not going to give away what happens, but weeks later, she returns home to Douglas. She is sutured and stitched and twisted by a pain that goes far beyond the physical in ways that she has not yet begun to comprehend. And she comes home and she kneels and she holds her 4-year-old son, Gabriel, as tight as her wounds allow. And she looks in his eyes and she says, "Gabriel, I promise I will never leave you again." And then the hardest part of her story begins. This is a book about the border we have made, about trauma, and about the courageous struggles of young immigrants fighting for survival and justice on that border. And it centers, as I've said, primarily on the story of one young woman, Ida Hernandez. And most of it takes place when Ida is in her teens and early 20s, and she's trying to do typical things, right? Pass algebra, watch Friends on TV, and dream of living in New York City, right? Leaving her small town. She sets her sights on a dance scholarship. She drinks a little too much with her sisters. She's coming to terms with her bisexuality, normal stuff. But she is growing up undocumented in Douglas during the 1990s and 2000s, just as policies crafted far from the border with little basis in the realities of actual migration or life on the border come crashing down on this town, placing it at the center of the storm of immigration debates for most of the next 20 years, and turning Douglas into one of the most heavily policed small towns in the United States. So Ida is also growing up poor, which brings us to a larger US story underpinning this border story. And this part is not intuitive, perhaps, to folks who view the border from a distance and really only think of it as kind of a backdrop for national immigration dramas, but it's crucial. And that's that for most of its history, the border was kind of a blurry afterthought in Douglas. What really gave the town meaning was copper and union work. Douglas was home to a vibrant copper industry and a powerful unionized Mexican-American working class that incidentally won one of the most important Supreme Court cases for labor rights in the post-war period. But in 1987, the year of Ida's birth, Phelps Dodge Mining, inspired by Reagan-era anti-union campaigns, closed its Douglas copper operations. and fled to less union-friendly lands. And almost overnight, the bad air cleared and the good jobs disappeared, and the town was never the same. And, you know, as in so many Black and brown communities hammered by plant closures, deindustrialization in this Mexican-American town was not met with elegies or calls for empathy. It was met with militarized policing and mass incarceration, albeit with a border twist. In the space of Ida's childhood, Douglas goes from being a copper company town to being a Homeland Security company town, from smokestacks to surveillance towers. And this growing up poor and undocumented in this context causes Ida's first death, a social death. And what I mean by that is that Ida is fully part of her community. She is an active maker of it, and yet she is denied real membership in it. She is a citizen without citizenship. She is cut off from rights and opportunities that should be hers. And because of this, we know she is going to pay a very high price for the kinds of small mistakes that any young person growing up in any town will make. And Ida has to fight for her life, literally several more times in this book. But her real struggle, the real suspense at the heart of this book is the struggle to get from that place of social death to a place where Ida isn't just surviving the world we have made on the US-Mexico border, she is thriving. She's truly alive. There's lots of spoilers and twists in this book, and I'm not going to tell too much of the story. So today, for the rest of tonight, I think I'll mostly talk about how the book came about, and then gesture at some conclusions that I think arise from it, and we can take it from there. I first went to the border in the fall of 1993, and it was the start of a lifelong connection to the borderlands and their beauty and creativity and cultural richness, something that often gets left out of reporting that only focuses on the border as a place of crisis. So that fall of 1993, though, when I first showed up at the border, was also a pivotal moment for border policy, because unbeknownst to all of us back then, a new approach to border security was taking shape. And it was getting tested in El Paso right at that moment. And it would end up becoming the single-minded center of our whole approach to the border and arguably immigration ever since. And by a fluke, I actually happened to be in El Paso the week it began in the fall of 1993. And basically it worked like this. Following a Clinton-era INS strategy blueprint, the local Border Patrol Sector Chief Reyes pulled his agents off of mobile patrols out in the countryside and just lined them up one after another in one short stretch of the downtown El Paso border. And the idea was that by completely shutting down the relatively easy urban crossing points with agents lined up and then later with walls, migrants would be forced out into the more hostile mountain and desert terrain on the outside. And the chief figured that this would make border crossing more dangerous and therefore more expensive and riskier, and then fewer people would do it. And this strategy was called prevention through deterrence. And this was the government deliberately weaponizing deserts in the service of deadly deterrence. A government report from that time says that an early sign of success of this program would be the increasing number of deaths on the southern border. And over the next 28 years, we would see the government deploy many new weapons of deterrence. They might not call them that. If they called them anything, they might have used the Orwellian label of consequence delivery system, by which I'm talking about Border Patrol agents slashing water bottles left in the desert by humanitarian groups, kids dying in cages, withholding vaccines from people in immigration detention, locking immigrants without criminal records who are pursuing legal immigration the right way in detention conditions that are worse than, and in some ways more poorly regulated than what you'd find in a medium security criminal prison. Deporting women alone into strange cities at 3 a.m. Now forcing Central American asylum seekers to wait in dangerous conditions in Mexico for their cases to play out, the heaping of criminal punishments onto civil immigration matters. When you see this kind of seemingly overwhelming jumble of hate and cruelty, when you see these things still happening, know that they are not aberrations. They're not the work of bad apples or artifacts of just the Trump administration. They are the results of a 28-year bipartisan strategy designed to make border crossing more dangerous and cruel, supposedly to deter migrants. And almost all of this strategy is still in place at the moment. And we will have to continue to fight to undo this 28-year strategy. And while the country's largest and most heavily funded police force, Customs and Border Protections, is certainly up to the task of enacting this strategy, not all of prevention through deterrence is done by government agents. And I'm sure that some of you, whether you will admit it or not, have watched the Sicario movies or maybe the Narcos series on TV. And to think about or to watch that genre of shows, you would think that violent cartels preying on vulnerable women and migrants were the enemies of the US government. In fact, by the strict logic of prevention through deterrence, right? A strategy designed to make border crossing more dangerous and cruel, they're our allies. They're force multipliers. And we have outsourced some of the worst parts of our efforts to make crossing the border more dangerous to cartels. And then we act shocked by their savagery. So remember this from this part of the talk. The border isn't broken. It's working more or less as intended. And that's the challenge we face in the coming years. Back in the 90s, the strategy spread quickly. It clicked instantly with President Clinton's desire to take a page from the Republicans' tough on crime dog whistle playbook. Later, Obama would bet wrongly, tragically wrongly, that wholehearted support for this strategy could be traded for immigration reforms. And it just turns out that ever more spectacular, ever more expensive forms of deterrence had bipartisan political appeal. And to give you a sense of the magnitude of this, I calculated for the book that we have spent the inflation-adjusted equivalent of 2 Marshall Plans for the reconstruction of Europe, funding deterrence-centric immigration enforcement since the policy rolled out. Of course, none of this achieved its stated goal. Deterrence does a lot of things politically, economically in our country. It's productive, it's beneficial for many people, politicians, companies, institutions, but it doesn't deter. We've had 28 years to see that is the case. Instead, by the late 1990s, what happened was that it began to funnel a continent's worth of migrants from Texas, from California, right into southern Arizona, and the border's most dangerous deserts. And one of the very first places that strategy came crashing down in the summer of 1997 was the small twin border communities of Douglas, Arizona, and Agua Prieta, Sonora, Logra Prieta, where Ida was growing up and where most of this book is set. People reeled. Politicians, the media, militias descended on their town. People chafed against the militarization of daily life, the imposition of new divides in their community, but they'd also come to depend on border security and insecurity spending as an economic lifeblood. By 2014, 1 in 7 employed adult men in Douglas worked for law enforcement. A vast border security industrial complex has taken shape. And this is far bigger than private detention centers. It's also things like small town budgets that rely on Homeland Security grants. It's the Douglas High School graduate who looks at her deindustrialized town and sees the Border Patrol as the only good job option, certainly the only one with benefits and a sense of purpose. It's the small businesses in Yakima, in Seattle, that depend on contracts with ICE. We have a whole diverse way of life that has taken form that depends not on improving conditions on the border, but on the maintenance of permanent border crisis for its existence. A whole range of communities and politicians and companies that have a stake in maintaining permanent border crisis. So back in 2014, I went to Douglas and Agua Prieta to try to understand how it is people were living their lives in this context of militarization. And early in that process, a woman named Rosy Mendoza became one of my main guides to the community. And some of you have read the book. If you've read the book, you know that Rosy is a badass, formerly undocumented social worker who works with victims of domestic and sexual violence on the border. And she figures heavily in the book. Her story has several chapters in the book. But she connected Ida and me, and she encouraged Ida to tell her story. And it took a while for us to actually meet. There's actually kind of a funny story of how we finally did meet, a very small town kind of story in the book that you can read. But suffice it to say that Ida and I met for the first time on a wintry day in the 10th Street Park, and we sat by the fountain and she told me her story. And I had not planned at all to write a book about one person, and much less to place violence against women at the heart of a border book. But I knew almost immediately after Ida and I spoke that she has a powerful message for everyone who looks at the border and immigration from a privileged position, and that our current approach to border security cannot be understood separate from the many ways it makes women's lives less secure and more exposed to violence. And Ida's story left me shaking on that day in 2014. It is filled with such intense suffering, but the thing that moved me the most on that day was not the pain. It was the fierce pride that she conveyed as she told her story. She exuded this kind of just irrepressible brio and wit and power from having survived by the seat of her pants time and time again, and having fought against huge odds for a place for herself and her son in this country. And amid all of that suffering was a message that the sheer act of surviving the world we have made on the US-Mexico border is itself a form of dignity and worth that is as valuable as any privileged person's accomplishments. And that hit me. As the writer Hector Tobar notes, that spirit of agency and the wit and brio is often left out of reporting on immigration. Reporting that portrays immigrants as passive victim props for tragic immigration tales. And I wanted to tell a different kind of border story. I wanted to convey that spirit. And of course, the idea of having someone write a book about you wouldn't necessarily click with a lot of people, but it did with Ida. And we talked about it for months. I wavered, but Ida was firm. She said, "Aaron, I have dealt with the worst possible people you can imagine, and they did not stop me. Telling my story is a way to turn all that suffering into something that can reach people and make a difference. And from there, the hard work of research began. Getting a story that's this sensitive and difficult right meant doing many hours of interviews with Ida, her family, her friends, other people whose lives intersected with hers, cross-checking those accounts with hundreds of pages of school and court and immigration and medical records, listening to court recordings, talking with attorneys and physicians and law enforcement officers and government officials and psychologists to verify the plausibility of her stories. And it also meant doing things to get the details right that I would not have expected to do. I have this image of Ida on her side of the country and me here in Washington State, and we're both on Google Street View of Douglas, and we're like, is that the tree you're talking about, the tree by the fence, the stone fence, and trying to get those details right? Or us on separate sides of the country watching Chola makeup tutorials together on YouTube. So coming into a project like this as a white man, even someone with experience doing border and immigration work for a long time, I knew that the risk of me missing things, of misunderstanding things, of exploiting people's stories was very real. And I spent a lot of time thinking about how, really whether to do this project, whether it could be done in an ethical way. And for me, putting that into practice meant carefully going over drafts of the book with Ida, and making this process as collaborative as possible and having her shape the narrative. Also getting drafts to her family and many other folks who appear in the book for feedback. It also meant engaging with scholars and activists of color through every stage of this project. People who read drafts or talk with me, who would understand the benefits, yes, of a project like this, but also the risks of a project like this in a really immediate way. And the question I often posed after folks read a draft in this stage was should I publish this? And I was really prepared to hear the answer no. Instead, the feedback and the critique and encouragement that came out of that process really shaped this book in profound ways. And 2 years into the research, Ida and I agreed that we would split proceeds from the book in 3 ways. A third for her, a third to fund work with people experiencing gender violence on the border, and a third to me to cover the costs of research and writing and the traveling to promote the book when that was possible. In the course of this, whenever we met, I made 3 commitments to Ida. The first was that she could end the project at any time if it didn't feel right to her. No matter how far along we were in that project, we would just stop. The second was that she would read drafts throughout the process and we would make it as collaborative as possible. And if she ever realized that she had revealed something in an interview that felt too personal in retrospect, she could tell me and I would just take it out. Those items, those commitments, and the profit sharing are not really the norm in journalism. And I received some critique from more hardcore journalists about that. But I would say it's very much the norm, the expectation even, in the world of ethnography and activism that I came out of. And the third commitment was that I would do my best to portray her not as a demon or a saint, but as a real, complex, flawed, brilliant person, and that her story would matter in itself and not just as a kind of illustration for a set of political arguments about the border. And that piece of messy humanity, about messy humanity, is really central, not just because it's so important for conveying dignity and trying to write a meaningful story, but it also ultimately gets to the heart of the message. And if there's one thing I hope that people will take out of the book, it's this. And that's to say that it is impossible to overstate how much our US immigration debates, even our sense of the United States as a nation of immigrants, turns on this impossible binary between the flawless, quote unquote, good immigrant who maybe deserves sympathy and rights, and the quote unquote bad criminal alien who deserves all the punishment she gets. As Rosi Mendoza, the woman I told you about earlier, as she often says, humans make mistakes, immigrants can't. But Ida's story does not disavow her many mistakes or solicit your pity. If you follow the threads of Ida's death, the one she survived, and her life, the one she is still fighting for, you will see that they challenge those of us who look at immigration and the border from a more privileged position to recognize that undocumented immigrants whose messy lives, human lives, don't fit into our good-bad binary are still deeply part of their communities. They are active members of their communities. They are active makers of those communities, regardless of whether they fit external images of perfection, innocence, achievement, and they should be recognized legally as such. I think I'll stop there. I've gone on for a little while. If folks have questions, we could segue to that. I'd be happy to take questions, and I guess Sarah will read the questions from the
Yes. We've got the first one just rolled in. It starts with a comment. Thank you for your work. I taught from this book in autumn, and it greatly impacted my students. Can you share how Ida is doing now? We're all rooting for her.
Yes, I can. And it's, you know, the book ends with Ida in a really difficult place. I won't say much about it. But in the year after the book, I finished writing the book, Ida ended up having to go into the New York City homeless shelter system, the family homeless shelter system. It's a really difficult year, but in many ways it was good because this was an incredible shelter that had on-site trauma counseling, really trauma-informed education programs for her son, and also just the space to live in New York without having to worry about how she's going to pay for rent, that really turned things around for her in a huge way. And she applied and got into a highly competitive program that trains peer mental health counselors, LGBTQ peer mental health counselors in New York City. And she graduated from that program a while back, I guess, if time is blurring in the pandemic, but I'm going to call it mid-pandemic. She graduated from that program. I remember because I couldn't go and I really wanted to go to the graduation. And that's really amazing for two reasons. First, the most important is because all throughout through the 5 years of working on this book, she would talk about how she wanted to be a counselor like Rosi. And how she wanted to be able to help people. And now she is trained and able to do that. And the other cool thing about that was that was an unpaid program that she trained in. And so it was actually her part of the book's royalties that allowed her to be able to live and to do that training program. So, you know, things are always still tough and complex. PTSD is a lifelong thing, but yeah, it feels much better now than it did in the kind of the final years when we were working on this project.
Okay, next question, along with some comments. A brilliant presentation. I read the book some months ago and it has haunted me ever since. Can you tell me about her son, how he is doing, and what steps can we, in privileged white surroundings far from the border, support and help these immigrants? Thank you for sharing profits with your subject collaborator partner, Bravo.
course. Yeah. And thanks for asking. About, in fact, I was just texting with Ida this morning, and I think like he's 16, and I think like all 16-year-olds, he's having a hard time with the whole online school thing. But it's also really difficult because our immigration system is designed to produce trauma, right? If you think about what I said in my talk, our immigration system is designed to produce trauma. That's not an accident or a kind of collateral damage. And part of that trauma comes from family separation, and not just family separation that kind of makes headlines, but the kind of family separation when Ida, for no good reason, is put into immigration detention for almost a year, and her son is left back in Douglas in really difficult circumstances, right? So he's experienced quite a lot of trauma directly and vicariously through Ida's struggles. So things are tough. But the move to New York was really profound because he was able to get into some trauma-informed elementary school programs. And that made a big difference. But it's tough. In terms of kind of unraveling this and building something new and what you can do locally, I want to make, since this is the Washington Book Award, I want to make a huge shout out to the Washington Immigrant Solidarity Network, which is an incredible organization, a statewide organization that is doing amazing work. Including just recently being one of the main partners in the community effort to distribute the Washington Immigrant Relief Fund to folks who were not able to receive the stimulus payments because of their immigration status. Incredible organization to get involved locally in Washington State. That's a very direct kind of thing you can do right now. There will be a lot more. This struggle is going to go on, and if Biden is where he is on immigration right now, which seems pretty good, it's because he's been pushed by a very active movement, primarily led by young immigrants and the children of immigrants. They have pushed for the last 4 years, and they're pushing Biden now. And that's why he's where he's at. And we're going to need to continue to push in the coming years to make sure that some of the proposed changes actually come about.
Will you and Ida have any input or consulting with the film adaptation, or was it a film or series?
It's going to be a series is the idea. And it's still a huge long shot. These things always are. So I'm trying not to have really many expectations. But yes, if it goes forward. Oh, and let me just share some cool stuff about it. One of the coolest things about it is that the person who is in charge of the development writing of the pilot and the series treatment as the award-winning, just internationally renowned Latina playwright Karen Zacarias, which is a really cool, it's just amazing to think about her taking the inspiration of this book and making it into something new. There will definitely be the producers have expressed that that Ida and I will both play some role in that, but it's also the kind of thing where they know their business a lot better than we do, but yes, I think there'll be some room for that. Thank you for that question.
Another question: how else has your background in ethnography impacted your approach to journalism?
Yeah, and I think the book, people will assume that the book is journalistic or that I'm a journalist, but I'm really not a journalist. And I think there's a couple levels. I think the stuff I mentioned before about the real focus on reciprocity and collaboration, I think is a key piece of that. My method was very much interdisciplinary in the sense that it involved a lot of deep deep, long interviews with many people, the kind of ethnographic interviewing, and just spending a lot of time in Douglas and Agua Prieta. And some people have called ethnography deep hanging out, and just really spending time to get to know the place. It was also really informed by the fact that I had spent time there in the 1990s and 2000s when a lot of the events in the book were playing out, even though I didn't know Ida then. But also bringing in historical archive work. I did a lot of work in the archives at the University of Arizona and at the Douglas Historical Society and other places. So I think that kind of ethnographic focus on the kind of deep, fine-grained time spent getting to know people and building relationships, plus the kind of focus on history and historical material is a key piece of that. And that was really crucial because a lot of people talk about this book as building empathy for immigrants or humanizing immigrants. And I hope that is a big part of what it's doing. But empathy is not enough, right? And empathy can actually be depoliticizing, in the sense that we can feel that empathy can become what we do politically. Like, I felt sorry for Ida, or I felt for Ida today. And that's my political response. And so in order to flip the lens from Ida to our own involvement in creating the world that Ida navigates, it was important to bring in all of the more political and economic and historical context and really weave that into the narrative. As much as maybe my publisher would have liked it just to be the narrative of Ida, it was really important to build that in and to make the kind of economic story and the militarization story of Douglas and Agua Prieta almost a character in its own right. And I think that's something that my ethnographic background brought or helped me bring to this project, is knowing how important weaving in that larger context would be, even in this narrative. And I'll tell you, I wrote the first draft of the book in about 9 months, and then it took over 2 years of editing, and most of the editing was trying to figure out how to weave the economics and the politics and the history and the legal material into the narrative in a smooth, hopefully not too disruptive kind of way.
Did you have much input on the creation of the audiobook?
Yeah, and it's a for those of you who have listened to it, it's a fantastic audiobook, and the narrator won an award for AudioFiles Magazine Best Audiobooks of 2019. She does an amazing job. She is Latina, but she is not Mexican, and certainly not from the border. And so we spent a lot of time going back and forth, thinking about how to kind of have her language really, and the way she speaks in the book, convey that kind of border Spanish and that border English. So that was a really cool process to watch. And then I record the final chapter of the audiobook, which is the part where the first time I enter the story, and I'm talking about the process of writing the book. Yeah, I am not a professional audiobook narrator at all, as my brother so kindly told me. He said it's a good thing that other person narrated the rest of the book, but it was a great challenge and fun to do that as well.
Thanks. And are you working on your next book yet? And if you are, can you tell us anything about it?
You know, I don't have a new book project at the moment. You know, for me, it takes a while to let this one settle a little bit, and I'm doing a lot of more deep kind of reflecting and thinking about the world, and trying to figure out what the next project will be. There was a kind of a border novel I was working on a little bit over the summer. We'll see if anything comes of that. But yeah, it's also, I think, really hard to to really think about a new book project in this moment where things are changing so dramatically and rapidly all the time. What's really going to matter is something that I'm still really thinking about.
What other authors have been influential to you while writing this book, or just in general?
Yeah, I mean, it's a dark secret that I guess I'm about to reveal in a session here, but I don't read a lot of nonfiction except for work, except for research. I've read some really great narrative nonfiction. Patrick Radden Keefe's Say Nothing, I just read recently. I was just blown away by his ability to do narrative nonfiction. Mostly I read fiction. And I think that really reading fiction, that experience seeps into this book and the way I tell the story. And I'm often telling my fellow academics that, like, we really novelists have been reading academic research and drawing on academic research for a long time. We academics also need to be drawing on the tools of novel writers, of fiction writers. So I've been reading it. I read a lot of fiction primarily. And of course, there's got to be a word for this, but I'm one of those people who, when asked for a book recommendation, I completely freeze in terms of what I've been reading. I can give you some really excellent books in addition to the Ida book. If you want to kind of think more about immigration in the current moment, I mentioned Carla Cornejo's The Undocumented Americans. Cesar Garcia Hernandez's Migrating to Prison is an incredible history of how we got an immigration detention system the way we have now and how it can be undone. Let's see. I actually wrote down a list because, again, I blank every time someone asks me for a book recommendation. I just finished reading Erica Lee's America for Americans, which is a history of xenophobia in the United States. Excellent. Laila Lalami's Conditional Citizens, also really good. I'm using that in my courses this semester. And then work by Todd Miller on climate change and migration is really quite good. Storming the Wall is an excellent book. And then Naomi Pike's book, Bans, Walls, Raids, and Sanctuary, is a really great book for understanding the Trump administration's immigration policies and then where we go from there. Those are a few of the kind of more border-focused, immigration-focused books I might want to give a shout out to.
Thank you. Before we started tonight, you were talking about before the pandemic, you were able to go to 23 cities, I think you said, touring this book. Were there any sort of surprises that came out of those events, or anything that sticks out of you, connections made that you didn't foresee?
Interesting question. I mean, for me, it was really powerful to be able to go and talk to readers. I really missed that in this virtual world. But I think the really amazing thing was to get to see immigrant rights organizing in lots of different places of the country and see how different communities are organizing, whether that's in upstate New York and more rural kind of immigrant rights activism, or in Madison, Wisconsin, in Chicago. It was really cool to get that insight. And what I was really struck by is we hear a lot about immigration or immigrant rights organizing in places like Seattle or New York City or Los Angeles, but all of the small, more rural, small town, often in very deep red or conservative states or parts of states that's happening is really inspiring. And I think that could be another project as I move forward, is thinking about how people in small rural towns, particularly really conservative ones, have mobilized around immigrant rights and creating the idea of creating a community that really acknowledges how much immigrants and undocumented immigrants contribute to the community and really are makers of those communities.
And has your book been translated?
No, and that is I'm quite frustrated by that. But yeah, no, we haven't been able to get a Spanish language publisher for it. There's some negotiations underway to get it translated into Portuguese, which is great. But I would really like a Spanish translation.
Definitely. And a question from earlier, we only have a few minutes left, but what brought you to El Paso in 1993, kind of when this journey began?
Yeah, right, because I was based on the Arizona-Sonora border and doing most of my work there. And at the time I was working for an organization that one of the things that organization did was bring folks together across borders. This was the era of NAFTA. Really, immigration hadn't exploded as a huge issue. Immigration was kind of it was just on the cusp of exploding, right? But it was still that feeling of like where home plate is in the United States and the outfield is in Mexico, and people's daily lives are lived across the border. And, you know, I remember sitting in a restaurant once and seeing someone passing a washing machine through a hole in the fence from the United States into Mexico, you know, either to evade the like taxes they might have had to pay if they went in through the official port of entry, or like maybe just because that hole in the wall and the fence was closer to their house, right? The way in which people really lived their lives across the border was still very real. And NAFTA and the economic impacts of NAFTA and the way corporations could cross borders with ease, but workers couldn't. That was the kind of stuff we were really working on and organizing around. And so one of the things we did was we brought, say, groups of auto workers from Detroit to talk with auto workers in maquiladora factories in Mexico, and kind of trying to bring them together to talk about how they can connect across borders and support each other, right? As opposed to being played against each other or played off of each other by the corporations. And so that trip to El Paso, I can't remember exactly which group it was, but I believe it was a group of union workers from the upper Midwest who were meeting with Mexican factory workers to talk about NAFTA and what NAFTA was going to mean for their livelihoods. And we just happened to see this this immigration thing playing out, and it seems so mundane at the time. I remember going up and talking to one of the agents who was in this lineup of Border Patrol agents in downtown El Paso. He was sitting there doing a crossword puzzle, right? This was the day before. Now they're on their phones playing games on their phones, but because I don't know if you noticed, but the average number of people that the average agent on the southern border detains in the space of a year, I believe the last time I checked the figures, it was around 2, right? So sitting in the car, doing a crossword puzzle, it seemed very mundane. We had no idea that it was going to become the centerpiece of this new and unbelievably lethal strategy that continues to kill people. In fact, it just came out that last year had the highest number of deaths crossing the Arizona border since they've been keeping track of this. So yeah, it was a strange thing to see such a lethal program beginning in such a mundane kind of way.
Yeah. Well, Aaron, we've reached our time, but thank you so much for your work, and thank you for being here with us tonight.
Yeah.
Congratulations again.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming.
Good night.